From the very first moment we stepped into that Georgia closing office, something in my gut whispered that the day was hiding more than it showed. You know that strange tension when the world feels too polite, too quiet, too perfect? That was the air around us as the realtor smiled wider than necessary and pushed paperwork toward us like a magician distracting the crowd. In the middle of a dozen signatures and rushed explanations, someone casually mentioned a $300 HOA fee. No description, no monthly breakdown, no list of services, nothing. Just a number thrown at us with the confidence of someone who expected no questions. My wife loved the house so much that she barely blinked. And because she believed in the idea of this perfect little neighborhood, I signed without realizing. I was already stepping into something that didn't smell right. 2 months later, the neighborhood still felt like a puzzle missing half the pieces. Clean lawns, polite waves, quiet evenings, everything looked normal. But normal can be the best camouflage. One afternoon, we noticed a small wooden sign near the entrance that read HOA meeting this Thursday. It felt like the right moment to finally meet the people who supposedly handled the fees we paid. When we arrived at the meeting, the living room was cramped with mismatched folding, chairs, and a faint smell of burned coffee. I ended up sitting beside the HOA treasurer, a man with thinning hair and a laugh that came too easily. He leaned toward me mid-conversation and said something that froze every thought in my head. I didn't know how much to charge the new guy, so I just pulled a number out of my ass. $300 sounded about right. I stared forward, expression frozen, wondering if he understood what he had just admitted. If he didn't know the fee, then who did? And what exactly had we paid for? As the meeting continued, they began arguing about who should mow the so-called community common area, a tiny 20 by 200 strip of grass that barely qualified as land. They expected someone to mow it for free. No reimbursement, no rotation, no rules, just whoever felt like being generous. It was becoming painfully clear this wasn't an organized HOA, it was a neighborhood hobby club, pretending to hold authority. Then came the reveal that snapped the illusion in half. One woman calmly mentioned that this HOA was completely voluntary. No mandatory dues, no required payments, no legal obligations. Voluntary. My heartbeat went loud in my ears. We had been tricked into paying $300 for a fee that didn't even exist. And in that moment, sitting in that suffocating living room, I realized this was just the beginning of the truth hiding behind their friendly faces. Because what happened next didn't just expose the HOA as voluntary, it exposed something far bigger. I walked out of that meeting with a tightness in my chest that wouldn't ease. The kind you get when the world suddenly tilts and you finally notice the cracks beneath your feet. For 2 months, I had believed we were paying for something real, something official, something documented. But the truth hit like a slap we never saw coming. A voluntary HOA had no power, no mandatory dues, and definitely no authority to demand $300 from anyone. Yet somehow they had taken it from us with the confidence of thieves who'd practiced their act for years. That night, I replayed every second from the closing meeting. Every fake smile, every rushed signature. Every moment where someone could have spoken up but didn't. The treasurer's voice echoed in my head. That stupid laugh when he bragged about pulling a number out of his ass. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was proof of deception. The next morning, I walked through the neighborhood with new eyes. The spotless lawns didn't look peaceful anymore. They looked staged, like props arranged to distract newcomers. The welcoming smiles felt hollow, too quick to fade when backs were turned. And the quiet streets felt less like tranquility and more like secrecy wrapped in sunshine. I found myself thinking about how many others had been fooled before us. How many families had signed paperwork under the illusion of a legitimate association? How many had paid fees without knowing they weren't required? The idea tightened something inside me. That evening, determined to get answers, I walked over to the treasurer's house. The man greeted me with the same forced politeness he wore at the meeting, but the moment I mentioned the closing fee, his smile twitched. He tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. Said that everyone contributes something, that it supports the neighborhood spirit, and that nobody complains. But I wasn't just anybody. I told him calmly that we wouldn't be paying another dime and that I wanted to know exactly why the fee was presented as mandatory when it wasn't. His eyes darted away. His excuses stumbled, and underneath his nervous babbling, I sensed something deeper, a fear that went beyond a simple mistake. The more he talked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a sloppy HOA. This was a group operating on assumptions, habits, and unspoken pressure, preying on newcomers who didn't know better. And when I finally walked away from his porch, leaving him stuttering behind me, a new question started pressing in my mind with uncomfortable weight. If the fee was voluntary and they still took it, then what else were they hiding? Because scams rarely happen alone, and secrets like these don't stay buried unless someone is benefiting from them. And the real shock came when I discovered exactly who had been benefiting, and for how long. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that the treasurer's nervous eyes were hiding more than a simple lie. So I started talking to neighbors one by one, casually at first, then more directly, trying to untangle whatever thread was still buried underneath this voluntary. "Show nonsense!" Most people shrugged, some laughed, and a few admitted they had paid something when they first moved in, but stopped after realizing nothing was ever enforced. The strange part was how differently everyone described the payment. One said $50, another said $100, someone else said $250. There was no pattern, no official rate, no written document, just random amounts whispered to newcomers like secret donations, and the treasurer always seemed to be the one collecting them. The more stories I heard, the more the puzzle pieces rearranged themselves into a picture. I didn't want to believe. This wasn't a community fee. It was an unofficial slush fund being quietly siphoned from unsuspecting homeowners for years, and the fact that no one questioned it told me fear and complacency had been the greatest tools, keeping this whole charade alive. One late afternoon, while walking past the so-called common area, I noticed the treasurer's old pickup pulled up near the grass strip. He wasn't mowing or trimming anything. Instead, he was unloading bags, heavy, unmarked, the kind that looked suspicious when handled with such care. He caught me watching from a distance and froze for a split second before forcing a wave and driving off too quickly. That moment burned itself into my mind. What exactly was he doing with HOA funds? And more importantly, why was he desperate to make sure people kept paying? That night, driven by frustration and curiosity, I dug through county records, property archives, and every legal document tied to our neighborhood. What I found made my stomach twist. The HOA had once been official, 15 years ago, but it was dissolved by the state for failing to file mandatory reports, meaning legally it no longer existed. It had no authority, no board, no power. Yet for years, someone kept pretending it was still active. Someone kept collecting money. Someone kept telling newcomers to pay fees they weren't obligated to pay. And all the trails led back to one person, the treasurer. He wasn't just guessing numbers out of thin air. He was running a long-term personal side hustle, hidden behind the reputation of a dissolved HOA, counting on the fact that nobody would bother to verify the truth. When I closed my laptop that night, the quiet inside my house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what I'd do next. Because it was clear now, this wasn't about grass cutting or community rules. This was organized deception built slowly over years, wrapped in neighborly smiles. And if he'd been bold enough to run this scheme for so long, I couldn't help but wonder how far he'd go to protect it. And the answer to that came sooner than I expected, when he finally confronted me, face to face, and everything took a turn I never saw coming. The confrontation came on a quiet Sunday evening when the sky hung, heavy with clouds, and the streets felt emptier than usual, as if the whole neighborhood knew something was about to break. I was walking back from the mailbox when the treasurer's truck rolled up beside me, slow and deliberate, the engine rumbling like a warning. He stepped out with that same forced smile he always wore. But this time there was no friendliness in his eyes, only a tight, nervous flicker that told me he already knew I had uncovered the truth. He didn't waste time. "Heard you've been asking around," he said, voice low, trying to sound calm but failing. I told him plainly that I knew the HOA had been dissolved years ago and that the fees he'd been collecting had no legal basis. The moment the words left my mouth, his face drained of color. His excuses fell apart instantly. First, he claimed it was an honest misunderstanding, then said it was a neighborhood tradition, then tried to blame paperwork delays, anything to keep himself afloat. But lies collapse fast when they're cornered. Finally, he dropped the act. "Look," he muttered, stepping closer. "You got your house at a good price. Everybody chips in. It keeps the neighborhood running. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be." The threat wasn't loud, but it was clear. He wasn't just trying to keep a little money flowing. He was trying to protect the illusion he had spent years building. I held my ground, told him I wasn't paying another cent, and that if he ever approached another newcomer with fake fees, I'd make sure the entire neighborhood knew exactly what he'd been doing. The air between us tightened. For a moment, he looked like he might explode, but instead he let out a frustrated breath, walked back to his truck and drove off without another word. The next morning, the handwritten HOA signs were gone from the entrance. The meeting notices vanished. The treasurer's truck didn't appear near the common area again. A week later, a neighbor quietly told me he had stepped down from all community involvement. No explanation, no apology, just disappearance. And the neighborhood, for the first time since we moved in, felt honest, peaceful, real. Sometimes the biggest scams aren't run by corporations or government agencies. They're run by regular people hiding behind friendly smiles and the blind trust of new homeowners. But once you pull back the curtain, even a decade-long illusion can crumble overnight. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that not every HOA hides behind rules. Some hide behind people. People who count on silence. People who count on confusion. People who count on newcomers who don't ask questions. But not anymore. Not for me. Not for anyone in this neighborhood again. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel.